So the United States had established itself as a country, and over time, the country really began to grow. And from very early on, there was an idea of wanting to expand to the west. And this idea later became known as manifest destiny. Manifest destiny is a really good term to know for the exam. It tends to come up a lot in questions. And that was, again, the idea that the United States wanted to expand all the way from the Pacific to the Atlantic to basically control North America. Let's talk a little bit about how it made some important land acquisitions. First of all, you had the land that was the territories of the original 13 colonies and the territories to the west of those, which they sort of took control of after winning their independence from Britain. Then we see the Louisiana Purchase. And this was purchased, the white region you see in the map here, this was purchased by Thomas Jefferson from the French. And the French ruler at the time was Napoleon, very famous French ruler. The French had given this land to the Spanish to compensate them for the loss of the Florida region after the French and Indian War. But this had eventually become too hard for the Spanish to manage, and so they had ceded it back to the French, and the French didn't really want to manage it either, so they sold it to the United States. And that almost doubled the United States' territorial holdings. As you can see, this white region called the Louisiana Purchase was a lot more than just what is now the state of Louisiana. It was a very, very large region. The blue region, which includes predominantly Texas, but some regions to the north of it as well, basically was acquired with the annexation of the Republic of Texas. Texas had been part of Mexico, but the people of Texas had become kind of discontent with Mexican rule. They felt it was too sort of disconnected from Texas, and so they had seceded from Mexico. And basically had started their own country, the country of Texas, which was the Republic of Texas, but then decided to join the United States and become a state. So the United States annexed the Republic of Texas, it became a state, and that's how the blue region became part of the United States. Then you see what was called the California Territory, essentially included California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, parts of New Mexico, part of Colorado. That whole territory became part of the United States after the United States won the Mexican-American War and signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. They had tried to purchase this region from Mexico for $35 million prior to the Mexican-American War, and had been turned down. After winning the Mexican-American War, they basically forced Mexico to sell this region for $15 million. Pretty low price for all that land. And that basically completed their expansion, that manifest destiny, that expansion all the way from the East Coast to the West Coast. This Mexican-American War that led to what led up to the Mexican-American War was actually a border dispute as well, because the United States had moved into some disputed territory along the Rio Grande, and that sort of started the war. So the war ended in them getting control of this massive, massive territory. Later, they got control of the Oregon Territory, basically from Great Britain, who they signed a treaty with. And then later, they purchased the smaller region south of the California Territory there in what was called the Gadsden Purchase. They purchased that from Mexico. So those are some of the very important acquisitions that led to the land that became the continental United States as we know it today. Later, they purchased Alaska as well, and they annexed Hawaii. And those would become sort of some of the final additions in terms of states in the Union, and that's how we come to have essentially the United States that we have today. As the country grew, it was respected as a power in North America, but it was not really respected as a seafaring power or a global power. And essentially, the French and the British were sort of picking on American sailing vessels. The French eventually promised not to do this anymore, but the British continued to do it. And one of the things that they were doing is impressing American sailors The term impressing means they were taking them off their ships and forcing them to work on British vessels. And so the United States, at least a lot of people in the United States, were pushing to go to war with England because of this and because of some other factors as well. So this sort of interference in shipping as well as some other factors. So the United States declares war against England, and they fight this war, the War of 1812. The United States gets control of some British land, the British get control of some American land, and in the end, there's no real clear winner, and they kind of sign a treaty that basically gives each other their land back. So the war was kind of a draw, but what it did do is sort of establish the United States as more of a naval power and more of a world power, not just a land-based North American power. And it also really established a strong feeling of nationalism. There had been a lot of political infighting before this period, and divisiveness between different states. But because of them all pulling together to fight this war, another war against the British essentially, it sort of recalled a lot of those feelings from the Revolutionary era and sort of created this national identity of we're Americans, a sort of unified identity, that idea of nationalism. As the country grew, it also, and this goes all the way back to the colonial era, even before independence, the southern regions in particular became very dependent on African slaves that were being brought from Africa. And so the African slave trade really became a big trade not only for the United States or the colonies that preceded the United States, but also European powers. Essentially, European powers would sail down to Africa. That was the first leg of their journey, the first passage. They would purchase people from their own leaders or kidnap people sometimes, and they would take those people to the Americas. That was the Middle Passage. So the first passage was to Africa. The Middle Passage was to the Americas. And this was where a sort of brutal, inhumane portion of that triangular trade route where slaves were being brought to the Americas for sale. And they would sell them, in particular in the southern colonies or later in the southern states. And they would use that money to purchase cash crops, things like cotton and tobacco and indigo. And then they would take those cash crops on the last passage of the journey back to Europe, where they would sell them for a big profit. So there's these three legs. That middle one was where people were being brought to the Americas. Often many, many people were stuffed below decks in really, really unsanitary and inhumane conditions. Many, many people died. So this was a very inhumane a portion of this journey and a sort of inhumane part of the history of both the British colonies and the United States. So because there was this sort of growing resistance to the idea of slavery, and in particular in the North, a lot of people didn't believe in having slavery. And this went all the way back to the colonial era. There were people who didn't believe in having slavery. The founding fathers didn't prohibit slavery because they were basically trying to reach compromises between the northern and southern states. But early on, we had people who were against slavery, and this abolitionist movement kind of continued to grow. And as it did, the South continued to feel more and more pressure because they felt like the federal government wanted to, or at least the Northerners wanted to abolish slavery, which would very, very badly damage the Southern economy. So each time new states joined the Union, it was a big fight, because if the new state would come in as a free state, it would give more power to the abolitionists. If it came in as a slave state, it would give more power to the southern slaveholding states. So to keep the Union together, they had a variety of important compromises. The first one you want to know about is the Missouri Compromise, and it basically, as Missouri was going to come into the Union, it was going to offset the balance of free states and slave states. So what they agreed to do was split off a portion of the Massachusetts territory and create the state of Maine. And essentially Maine would become a free state, Missouri would come in as a slave state, and that would preserve the balance. So for a while that sort of appeased everybody, and it looked like the Union was going to hold together. Then we had the Compromise of 1850, and this arose around California coming into the Union. California was very, very populous even at this time. Over 380,000 people were living in the California territory when it was admitted as a state. So it's going to give a lot of votes and power in the government, especially in the House of Representatives, to the abolitionists or to the slaveholders. So there was a big fight over it. And so the compromise that was arrived at, this 1850 compromise, was that California would come in as a free state, but the new territories of New Mexico and Utah, when they became states, they would have a choice about whether to be slave states or free states. They wouldn't be forced to be free states. And it also basically said, as part of this compromise, that there would be very, very strict laws to capture runaway slaves. So that compromise held things together for a little longer. But then again, there was sort of fighting and conflict as Kansas and Nebraska were going to join the Union. And the Kansas and Nebraska Act got passed, which basically said that those two states could choose whether or not to come in as slave states or free states. And a lot of people became very angry about that because they thought that those states should be required to come in a certain way based on the Missouri Compromise. So when they were given that choice, it sort of incensed a lot of people in the North and the South for different reasons, and it became clear that despite these attempts to compromise, the abolitionist movement was growing stronger, and there was conflict between the North and the South that might eventually result in a split between the northern and southern states. Events such as the Dred Scott decision and the election of Abraham Lincoln just further inflamed the nation and further inflamed these conflicts. The Dred Scott decision was about a slave who had escaped and was in a free state. So if he's in a free state, he basically should have been free. And the owner was trying to get this person back. And the decision basically said that because a slave is not a human being, then he's property, and therefore would not have the right to be considered free because he's in a free state. He's the property of the person in the slave state, and so then he can be retrieved as property. And this really angered a lot of abolitionists and angered a lot of people in the North. So that led to a lot of Northerners sort of pushing harder for abolition. And a thing that incensed the South was the election of Abraham Lincoln. Initially, Abraham Lincoln didn't really have that strong of an abolitionist stance, but he saw that his party was actually very strongly abolitionist, and so he grew to become much more abolitionist somewhat for political reasons, though possibly for philosophical reasons as well, over time. And by the time he got elected as President of the United States, the South perceived him as a very abolitionist president, and feared that he was going to attempt to abolish slavery in the South. And that pushed them further toward wanting to secede from the Union. So all of these things are things that surrounded this conflict between the North and South over slavery that would lead to a big rift or divide in the United States.